here you are, you become deputy press secretary. We're fast forwarding here. And so you meet the president the first time. And I had the privilege to interview him 2 years ago at our huge leadership event, and I couldn't believe I'd heard how charming he was and down to earth. And I interviewed him for an hour in front of 6,000 leaders. So that's a whole different weird world.
I just did the same thing last Monday.
Did you?
With him?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I got
an event in Dallas.
I got to tell you, he was so unbelievably charming and hilarious. But I'm just curious, and I asked him at one point in the interview, I said, I've done a lot of research and I've read that your whole career you've been known for giving people nicknames to the point that he's famous for it. And I said, I'm just curious, was that an intentional leadership thing? And so anyway, he basically went on to say, yeah, I'm the most powerful person in the world. And I realized that if I did that, I could put people at ease. I'm just curious about when you first start to work with him. Here you are, you're a female. This is one of the most powerful men in the world, the most powerful man in the world. And even though he was charming to you and very accepting of you, what can women learn from that moment where you're there because of what you can do and you've got the chops? I mean, you earned it, but there you are all of a sudden where you're a voice in that room. I'm just curious what that was like and what you learned from that. What women specifically, my daughter Josie, what can she learn from that experience?
Well, it didn't happen all at once. I was a spokesperson at the Justice Department for about 9 months, and then I got pulled over to the White House to head up communications for the White House Council on Environmental Quality, which oversees all environmental issues and energy issues. So I got so deeply ingrained in all the issues regarding climate change and healthy forests and our oceans, air pollution, you name it. I was really deep on that. And Ari Fleischer and Scott McClellan, press secretary and deputy at the time, knew that anytime they had the New York Times call them about the roadless rule out in the mountain states, that they could send it over to me and I would handle it. So one of the things I always tell people is take the jobs nobody else really wants at the time.
Yeah.
And because in the first term of the Bush administration after 9/11, you wanted to work on terrorism.
Right.
I was working on the environment.
Right. Yeah.
But I did that where they didn't have to worry about it at all. So when the deputy position came open, when Ari moves on, Scott becomes press secretary, there's a changing of the personnel going into the second term. I got hired to be the deputy press secretary. I don't remember. I had met the president before then, but like barely, shaking a hand.
Yeah,
that was pretty much it. So I had just started. This is the great story about one embarrassing thing.
Oh, this is you getting kicked out?
Yeah.
This is very exciting.
So I had just started and I was at the communications meeting with our head of communications, Dan Bartlett, who's now head of communications for Walmart. And he says, Dana, I am double booked. And I wondered, could you sit in on an interview that the president needs to do at 11 with a columnist? And it's a 30-minute interview. I just need you to be there, welcome the guy, take notes on the interview, and cut it off after 30 minutes. I'm like, yeah, okay, I can do that. But he could tell I'm nervous because it's going to be in the Oval Office. He says, I will go and do the pre-brief with you, and then I'll go to my other meeting. I said, okay, great. So now I can hide behind Dan as I go into the Oval Office for the first time, and it's so majestic. It's just...
I can't even imagine.
It's America and the Constitution and amazing and the energy. It's all of it. It's so talk about it. He says he's the powerful person. He's intimidating in a way, and the room's intimidating.
Right.
But what happened was Bartlett says, Mr. President, Dana's here to, I don't even know if he said Dana. He said, you have an interview with this columnist and she's going to sit in. I don't even know if the president knew my name at the time, but he might have said, Dana's here to do the interview. And the president looked at me and gave me a nod. I'm like, okay. And he says, but Dan, I'm not doing an interview with him. I said I would talk to him. I didn't say I would do an interview with him. And there's been a classic miscommunication.
Oh, boy.
Okay.
Right.
And Dan has told this prominent columnist, that he's going to get an interview with the president. And the president's saying, no, I'm not doing that. Because if I do that, then the Iranians will think I'm negotiating with them through this report. And I'm not going to do that.
Right.
He's welcome to come in, but I'm not doing an interview. And therefore, Dan, she doesn't need to be here.
Oh.
And he looked at my way and went like this. So for you listeners, the head nod towards the door.
Right.
And I felt,
you could let
I'm 5
yourself
feet
out.
tall. I felt 5 inches tall.
Of course. Of course.
I basically, I don't know how I stayed upright. I wanted to crawl back to my office.
Yeah.
I get to my little tiny office. It had a pocket door and I closed the door behind me. And when I said that Peter has been my best career asset, I call my husband and I'm tearful, but not crying.
Right.
Trying to be brave. And he says, what happened? So I tell him the whole story. And he said, oh my gosh, this is amazing because for the rest of your life, you can say, I've been kicked out of better places than this.
Yes. He spun it for you.
So 5 years later, I was doing the press for the president's book tour in the post-presidency. And we were on a flight, just shooting the breeze about things. And I said, hey, Mr. President, do you remember when you kicked me out of the Oval Office? And he said, I never kicked you out of the Oval Office. I said, oh, yes, you did. Don't you remember? Because you said you didn't want to do an interview and Dan said this and blah, 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 blah. And then you said, and then he said, wait, are you still upset? I said, a little bit. I could remember every moment of that humiliation of getting kicked out of the Oval Office, but it's also become one of my favorite stories. And he said, I think you can let it go now. I was never mad at you.
Right. Exactly. That's so great.
So that's just it. But to answer that's a story that doesn't exactly answer your question about young girls and thinking about these things, which is one, I have a strong belief in being the most well-read person in the room.
Yeah.
And when I was press secretary, I read everything constantly. I was up at 4 a.m.
Yeah.
And I wanted everybody in that room to know that I know more than you.
Right.
And that was power for me, right?
Sure.
The other thing is you have to find your strong voice.
Mm.
A lot of young people today, maybe your daughter's age, but even older, I hear it sometimes in the workplace. Mm-hmm. Do you know when people talk like this and at the end of every sentence, they're...
Oh, yeah. It's dripping of insecurity.
It's called up talking, and I can't stand it.
Oh, that's
and
good.
it is. I think that it is hurting, especially young women. It is hurting their ability to get jobs, to get a promotion, to get the opportunity, and we have an obligation as the older generation now to gently take them aside and privately say, you might not even realize you're doing this, but it's holding you back. And you have to find your strong voice. I just did an event last week with Shelley Moore Capito in West Virginia with 5th graders. And when we were doing Q&A and we were in a gymnasium, we were asking them to raise their hand. And and there's like so little confidence. So I did an exercise with them. It's like, everybody talk like that for a second. And they did. And I said, now pretend like you can talk from here. And use this power. God gave you all this power right here.
That's right.
And you can control that. The other thing is, I think humility and grace go a long way. You know, if the president asked a question and I didn't know the answer, I didn't ever fake it. I would say, I don't have that answer for you right now, but I'll get it to you by the hour. Yeah. And that would be appreciated by him. I just learned so much about leadership and principles from him that I really think followed from my childhood, growing up on the ranch and with my own family and in the church. I felt very at home with him.